Alright, listen up. Today we are talking about Rosa Parks. And I already know the version you have in your head. It's the one from the 3rd grade coloring book. You see a sweet, quiet, grandmotherly type. She's had a long day at work. Her feet are sore, and she just doesn't feel like moving. Let me tell you something. That version is total nonsense. It is a fairy tale we tell kids so they think social change happens by accident. Rosa Parks was not some accidental hero who just happened to be tired. She was a tactical genius. She was a trained activist. She was the secretary of the NAACP, and she was a woman who had been dealing with the nonsense of the Montgomery bus system for over a decade. When she sat down on that bus, she wasn't just resting her legs. She was planting a flag. She was inviting a fight that she knew she could win. This wasn't a moment. It was a movement, and it started long before that bus ever pulled up to the curb. So, let's go back to the beginning. Rosa was born in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1913. Now, imagine being a black child in Alabama in 1913. You aren't just dealing with rude people. You are living in a world that is actively trying to break your spirit every single day. Her grandfather, he used to stand on the front porch with a shotgun while the KKK marched down the street. That was Rosa's childhood. While you were worried about your cartoons or your cereal, she was watching her grandfather prepare for a literal war in his front yard. She went to a one-room schoolhouse, while the white kids down the street had a brand new building and a bus to take them there. Rosa had to walk, and she said, very early on, that she realized there was a world for the white kids and a world for her, but she didn't get sad about it. She got focused. She eventually moved to Montgomery, and she married a guy named Raymond Parks. Now, Raymond was a barber, but he was also a serious activist. He was part of the group trying to save the Scottsboro boys. This was a house where they didn't just talk about the weather. They talked about justice. They talked about the law. They were the original power couple of the civil rights world. Being an activist in the 50s, it wasn't like having a Twitter account today. It meant you were on a list. It meant people knew where you lived. Raymond was a barber, and the barbershop, well, that was the secret headquarters of the revolution. While he's cutting hair, he's passing messages. He's raising money for legal defense funds. This was dangerous stuff. They'd have meetings in their house, in the dark, with the curtains closed. Because if the wrong person saw who was visiting, the house might not be there in the morning. Raymond eventually had to quit his job because the owners of the shop told him he couldn't even mention the boycott. Think about that. You're a grown man, a professional, and you're being told what words you can say while you work. He walked away from his paycheck to keep his dignity. That was the environment Rosa lived in. She didn't just wake up one day and decide to be brave. She lived in a house where bravery was the only way to survive. They were two hustlers, working the system, waiting for the right moment to break it. We have to talk about the buses in Montgomery. Because if you think it was just sit in the back, you don't know the half of it. The system was designed to be as annoying and insulting as possible. The bus drivers, they weren't just drivers. They were basically petty dictators with a badge. They carried guns. They would make black passengers pay at the front, then make them get off the bus and walk to the back door to get on again. And sometimes just for fun, the driver would pull away while the person was walking to the back door. They'd take your money and leave you standing in the dirt. Think about that level of pettiness. You're just trying to get home to cook dinner, and this guy is playing keep away with a multi-ton vehicle just because he can. Rosa had actually been kicked off a bus 10 years earlier by a driver named James Blake. You ever have a boss or a neighbor that you just cannot stand? Someone who just enjoys being a jerk? That was Blake. 12 years before the famous arrest, in 1943, Rosa got on a bus driven by Blake. She paid her fare at the front, but she refused to get off and walk to the back. Blake got physical. He grabbed her sleeve. He tried to push her off. Rosa told him, "I will get off, but don't you dare hit me." She got off, and Blake drove away before she could get to the back door. He stole her money and left her in the rain. For 12 years, Rosa memorized that man's face. She would look at the driver of every bus that pulled up, and if it was Blake, she'd wait for the next one. She wasn't being scared. She was being smart. But on December 1st, 1955, she saw it was him, and she got on anyway. It was a rematch 12 years in the making, and this time, she wasn't getting off. So, Blake pulls the bus over. The engine is idling, that low, rattling sound, and the whole bus goes dead silent. You ever been in a room where the air just gets heavy? That was the Cleveland Avenue bus. Everyone realized this wasn't just a regular delay. This was a standoff. Blake is staring at her through the mirror, and Rosa is staring right back. For 12 years, she'd been dodging this guy like he was a pothole in the road. But now she's the one blocking his path. And you gotta wonder, did Blake remember her? Did he look at her and see the woman he shoved out into the rain back in 43? Maybe. Or maybe she was just another passenger to him, which is exactly why he was about to lose. He's expecting her to flinch. Most people would. But Rosa just sits there, calm, with her purse in her lap. She wasn't being defiant in a loud way. She was being composed, and that is what drove guys like Blake insane. He wanted a reason to get violent. He wanted her to scream so he could call her hysterical. But she didn't give him anything. He asks her again, "Are you going to stand up?" And she gives him that line. No, just one syllable. It's the shortest, most powerful word in the English language. Blake is stuck. He can't move the bus because the rules say he has to seat the white passenger, but he can't make Rosa move without looking like a monster in front of a full bus. So he does the only thing a petty man can do when he's losing an argument. He calls for backup. He tells her he's calling the police. He's thinking this will scare her, she'll run now. But Rosa just looks out the window. She's basically saying, "Take your time, James. I'm not in a rush." While they wait for the cops, the other passengers are whispering. Some are terrified they're going to get caught in the crossfire. Others are looking at Rosa like she's a ghost. But for Rosa, this was the quietest moment of her life. She had spent 12 years looking over her shoulder for this man, and now that he was standing right in front of her, she realized he didn't have any real power over her at all. The only power he had was the power she gave him, and she just revoked it. The police arrive. They ask her why she won't move, and she asks them a question that they can't answer. She asks, "Why do you all push us around?" The officer doesn't have a comeback for that. He just says, "I don't know, but the law is the law and you're under arrest." And just like that, James Blake gets exactly what he wanted. He gets her removed from the bus. But what he didn't realize, as he watched her get led away in handcuffs, was that he had just driven his last quiet route. He had just handed the match to the gasoline, and his little kingdom of petty rules was about to go up in smoke. So Rosa is in a jail cell. She's sitting there probably wondering if the walls are closing in. But outside? Outside the city is on fire. And I don't mean literal flames. I mean the telephone lines are melting. E.D. Nixon, the guy from the NAACP, calls up a woman named Joanne Robinson. Now you need to remember that name. Joanne was a professor at Alabama State, and she was the head of the Women's Political Council. She had been waiting for a moment like this for years. She doesn't wait for a committee meeting. She doesn't wait for permission. She sneaks into the college basement in the middle of the night. She and two students stay up until the sun comes out, cranking a mimeograph machine by hand. You know those old machines? The ones that smell like chemicals and make your arms ache? They cranked out 35,000 flyers. There's no Instagram. There's no send-all button. These women spent the entire night printing, then they loaded the flyers into their cars, and spent the next morning dropping them off at every black school, barbershop, and beer hall in Montgomery. The flyer basically said, "Rosa Parks got arrested, so don't ride the bus on Monday, period." And here's the irony. One of the flyers fell into the hands of a woman who worked as a maid. She showed it to her boss. The boss got scared and called the local newspaper to complain about a rebellion. The newspaper, thinking they were doing a public service for the white community, printed the entire text of the flyer on the front page. They literally gave the boycott free advertising. They handed a megaphone to the revolution because they were too arrogant to realize they were helping it. While the city leaders were laughing, thinking nobody would actually walk to work, the black community was holding a meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church. Thousands of people showed up. They were standing in the streets for blocks just to hear the speakers. And when that new kid, Martin Luther King Jr., stood up to speak, he realized he didn't have to convince them. Rosa had already done the hard part. The stage was set. Monday morning came, and the buses pulled up to the stops, and they were empty, just the driver and his gun, sitting in a giant rolling ghost ship. So the boycott is in full swing. The buses are empty, the city is losing money, and the world is finally watching. But we have to address the why. Why did this work? It worked because of a high-level, stone-cold PR strategy. You see, most people think Rosa was the first person to ever think of staying in her seat. She wasn't. We have to talk about Claudette Colvin. 9 months before Rosa ever sat down, Claudette was a 15-year-old student who did the exact same thing. She sat down, she refused to move, and she was dragged off the bus in handcuffs. She was a hero, but the leaders of the movement, the strategists like E.D. Nixon and Joanne Robinson, they were playing a long game. They looked at Claudette, and they saw a teenager who was pregnant, and well, let's just say she wasn't exactly what the polite society of the 1950s wanted as their poster child. They knew the opposition would tear her apart. They'd call her unreliable or emotional. They realized that to win in the court of public opinion, and in the actual Supreme Court, they needed a symbol that was bulletproof. They needed someone the media couldn't touch. And that is why they chose Rosa. Rosa was the unimpeachable pro. She was older, she was a churchgoer, she was married, and she was calm. And here is the detail most people miss. She was a seamstress at the Montgomery Fair department store. Think about that job. It's a job of quiet middle-class dignity. She spent her days mending the clothes of the very people who looked down on her. When the case went to court, the opposition couldn't say she was a radical or a troublemaker. She was just a hard-working woman who wanted a seat after a long day of work. That cold, tactical decision to wait for the right person is what made the legal case move. It gave the movement a face that the entire world could respect. While the lawyers were fighting in court, the community was doing the real work. They built the rolling churches. Since the buses were off limits, they organized a fleet of private cars and taxis. They had dispatchers, they had schedules, they had a whole underground transportation empire. This wasn't some loosely planned carpool, this was a logistical masterclass. They had pickup points at churches and grocery stores, and they kept it running like a Swiss watch for over a year. And think about Rosa, back at her sewing machine during all this. Like we said, her whole life was about mending. Every day at the department store, she was taking pieces of fabric and joining them together. She spent her days fixing the torn clothes of the people who were trying to keep her down. But now, she was mending the law itself. Think about the precision that takes. You don't just rip a seam open and hope for the best. You have to be careful. You have to be deliberate. She wasn't just patching up a coat. She was restitching the fabric of American society. Every day she walked to work instead of riding. She was adding another stitch to a new garment of justice. She was showing the world that the old fit of the country didn't work anymore. It was too tight, it was uncomfortable, and it was falling apart at the seams. She was the one with the needle, and she was refusing to let the thread snap. She was turning a tear in the community into a bond that couldn't be broken. But don't think for a second it was all sunshine and parades once the ruling came down. The aftermath was brutal. The victory didn't come with a giant check or a guaranteed job. In fact, it was the opposite. Rosa and Raymond lost everything. They were blacklisted in Montgomery. Imagine being a professional, a person with a trade, and suddenly nobody will hire you because you had the audacity to want to sit down. The bank wouldn't look at them. The neighbors were sometimes too scared to talk to them. They were getting death threats at 3 a.m. They had to move to Detroit just to find a way to eat and live in peace. They paid a heavy price for those seats at the table. But Rosa didn't stop. She spent the next 40 years in Detroit, working for Congressman John Conyers, founding the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development, and continuing to push for the things that matter. She wasn't just the lady on the bus who disappeared into a history book. She was a lifelong mechanic of the civil rights movement. She was the one in the back rooms, the one organizing the youth, the one making sure the next generation knew how to hold their ground. She lived to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She lived to see the world finally realize that she wasn't a tired old lady. She was a giant who had been standing tall the whole time. So, what do we take away from this? Rosa Parks showed us that you don't need to be the loudest person in the room to be the most powerful. In a world that tells you that you have to scream to be heard, she proved that silence and a steady gaze can be a louder roar than any megaphone. She showed us that a quiet no, when backed by a solid strategy and a community that has your back, can topple an empire. She wasn't a saint, and she wasn't an accident. She was a woman who understood the hustle of history. She took the needle and thread of her own life and used it to sow a new future for everyone. It's about the long game. It's about being the person who stays in the seat when everyone else is telling you to move. It's about knowing your worth even when the law says otherwise. Next time you feel like you don't have a voice, or you feel like the system is too big to move, remember the seamstress from Alabama. She didn't sit down because her feet were tired. She sat down so that a whole nation could finally stand up and look itself in the mirror. She knew that the second best bed, or the back of the bus, wasn't where she belonged. She belonged exactly where she chose to be. She was a genius, she was a strategist, and she was quite simply a luminary mind.